Some truths don't just break your heart, they crush it slowly, piece by piece, until you're left wondering if you ever truly knew the people you loved most. I'm 73 years old, and if you'd asked me yesterday, I'd have said I'd lived long enough to recognize betrayal from a mile away. But life, I've learned, has a cruel way of reminding you that some wounds cut deeper than you ever imagined. My name is Grace Mitchell. For 37 years, I believed my daughter cherished the sacrifices I'd made and remembered the humble home she came from. Yet, as I stood in front of the mahogany door of her mansion, feeling smaller than ever, I realized something was terribly wrong. And when that door opened, it wasn't just my daughter's eyes that refused to meet mine. It was what I saw lurking in the shadows behind her that revealed a secret so devastating. I wished I'd never knocked. In that instant, I understood the heartbreaking truth. Sometimes the ones you love most hold the sharpest knives if stories of love, loss, and quiet strength speak to you. Go ahead and tap subscribe now and ring that tiny bell so you'll never miss the next letter from a heart like mine. My hands still remember the weight of that porcelain mug, the one with tiny blue roses painted around the rim. I'd kept it wrapped in tissue paper for 3 months, waiting for the right moment to give it to Sarah. It belonged to my grandmother, passed down through generations of women who knew the value of small, beautiful things, the kind of women who made do with less, but somehow created more love in the process. Sarah used to trace those little blue roses with her finger when she was small, sitting at our kitchen table after school. "When I grow up, Mama, can I have Grandma's special cup?" she'd ask, chocolate milk mustache decorating her upper lip. I'd always smiled and said, "Someday, sweetheart, when you have your own home." That someday had arrived, but the little girl who loved blue roses seemed to have disappeared somewhere along the way. The last time we really spoke, she'd mentioned I should drop by sometime when I was in the neighborhood, her neighborhood, as if the 40-minute bus ride to her gated community was something I'd casually stumble into. But mothers hear what they want to hear, don't they? I heard an invitation where there might have been politeness. I heard love where there might have been obligation. I'd raised Sarah alone after her father left us when she was 12. 3 jobs, night school, second-hand everything. But somehow, we made it work. She got her scholarship, then her degree, then her MBA. Each achievement felt like a small miracle. Proof that sacrifice meant something, that love could build bridges across any gap, even the ones carved by poverty and broken promises. The morning I decided to visit, I wrapped that mug extra carefully. The tissue paper crinkled under my fingers like whispered secrets. I could almost hear my grandmother's voice. "Grace, child, some gifts carry more than just pretty things. They carry our stories." I tucked it into my best purse, the black one I'd bought for Sarah's college graduation, and caught the first bus into her world. Looking back now, I should have known that some neighborhoods aren't meant for surprise visits. Some doors aren't meant to be knocked on without warning. Some daughters grow up and forget that love doesn't require an appointment. But how was I supposed to know that the little girl, who once begged for bedtime stories, would one day make me feel like a stranger at her door? The mansion sat behind iron gates like something from a magazine I'd never be able to afford. 6 bedrooms, Sarah had mentioned once, though she'd never invited me to count them myself. Swimming pool, 3-car garage, gardens that looked like they required their own staff. Everything I'd dreamed of giving her but never could. Everything I'd worked multiple jobs to make possible, even if I couldn't provide it directly. I remembered the nights I'd fallen asleep at the kitchen table. Homework spread between unpaid bills and grocery lists. Sarah would find me there in the morning, my cheek pressed against her math worksheets, drool smudging the numbers I'd helped her practice. "Go to bed, Mama," she'd whisper, covering my shoulders with the afghan my mother had crocheted. Even then she was taking care of me. Even then, she understood that love sometimes looks like exhaustion. The university acceptance letters had arrived like answered prayers. Full scholarship, they said. Full ride to a future I'd only been able to imagine for her. I'd cried in the bathroom that night, muffling my sobs in a towel so Sarah wouldn't hear. Not sad tears, grateful ones. The kind that come when you realize your sacrifices actually meant something, when you understand that love can indeed buy what money never could. Opportunity. Her wedding had been beautiful, even if it felt like watching a movie about someone else's life. The country club, the 7-course dinner, the photographer who cost more than I made in 6 months. Sarah had looked radiant in her designer dress, but when she hugged me after the ceremony, something felt different, careful, like she was embracing me across a distance that hadn't existed before. I told myself it was just nerves, just the overwhelming nature of such a big day. The phone calls had grown shorter over the years, monthly, then seasonal, then just holidays and birthdays. "How's the new house?" I'd ask. "Fine, Mom. Busy with renovations." "How's Marcus?" "Good. Traveling a lot for work." Each conversation felt like trying to hold water in my cupped hands. No matter how gently I approached it, something essential kept slipping through my fingers. That morning, riding the bus past neighborhoods that grew increasingly pristine, I clutched the wrapped mug and told myself this visit would change things, that seeing each other face to face would bridge whatever distance had grown between us, that love was stronger than marble countertops and gated communities, that daughters don't forget the mothers who gave them everything, even when everything wasn't very much at all. The security guard at the gate looked at me like I'd stepped out of a time machine. My sensible shoes, my careful makeup, my purse clutched tight against my side. Everything about me screamed, "Doesn't belong here." I gave him Sarah's name and address, watching his expression shift from suspicion to something that might have been pity. "She expecting you, ma'am?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a cigarette. I'd never learned to smoke. "I'm her mother," I said, as if that should explain everything, as if that title still carried the weight it used to when Sarah was small and needed me for scraped knees and bad dreams. The guard made a phone call, spoke in hushed tones, then waved me through with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Have a nice visit," he said, and I wondered if he could see the hope trembling in my hands. The flowers I'd brought, simple chrysanthemums from the grocery store, suddenly felt inadequate against the backdrop of professionally landscaped perfection. Every blade of grass seemed to be exactly the right height, every tree positioned with mathematical precision. I walked up the curved driveway, my reflection multiplying in the windows of luxury cars that cost more than I'd ever owned. The mug felt heavier with each step, weighted down by the growing certainty that I'd miscalculated something important. Standing at the front door, I noticed my hands were shaking, not from age, from something harder to name. Fear, maybe, or the recognition that this moment would change things one way or another. The doorbell played a melody I didn't recognize, something classical and refined that seemed to echo in spaces I'd never seen. I smoothed my hair, straightened my shoulders, and prepared to smile the way mothers do when they want their children to be happy to see them. Minutes passed. I could hear movement inside, hushed voices, footsteps on what sounded like marble floors, the kind of pause that happens when people need to decide something, when spontaneous visits require consultation and conversation. I shifted the flowers to my other arm, the cellophane crinkling like autumn leaves, and told myself that Sarah was probably just finishing something important, probably putting on lipstick or tidying up before opening the door to her surprise guest. But when the door finally opened, the look on my daughter's face told me everything I needed to know about surprise visits and the space between expecting love and receiving it. Some expressions can't be hidden, no matter how much money changes hands or how many years pass between kitchen table conversations and marble foyer confrontations. And the expression on Sarah's face wasn't the one I'd been hoping to see. Sarah stood there in clothes that cost more than my monthly rent, her hair perfectly styled in a way that spoke of weekly salon appointments and products I'd never heard of. But it was her eyes that stopped me cold, wide with something that looked less like surprise and more like panic, the kind of look people get when they've been caught doing something they shouldn't be doing, when they realize that secrets have expiration dates. Mom, just that one word, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken conversations. Not, "Mom, what a wonderful surprise," or "Mom, come in." Just "Mom," like my name was a problem she needed to solve quickly and quietly. She glanced over her shoulder, a gesture so quick I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching her face so carefully, if I hadn't been hoping to see joy there instead of whatever this was. "I brought you something," I said, holding up the flowers like a peace offering to a war I didn't know we were fighting. "And I have that mug I mentioned, Grandma's porcelain cup with the blue roses. I thought maybe we could have tea together, like we used to." My voice sounded strange in the cavernous entryway, smaller than I remembered it being, older, more desperate than I'd intended. She took the flowers with hands that trembled slightly, and for a moment I thought I saw the little girl who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by something that looked like calculation, like she was measuring the distance between politeness and honesty, trying to figure out which one would get her through this unexpected complication in her carefully orchestrated day. "This isn't really a good time," she said, but her words were interrupted by footsteps coming from somewhere deeper in the house. Heavy footsteps that belonged to someone moving with the confidence of ownership. Someone who didn't need to ask permission to walk through these rooms. Someone who belonged here in a way that, apparently, I didn't. The footsteps grew closer, and I watched my daughter's face change in ways that reminded me of watching storm clouds gather on summer afternoons. Dark, inevitable, charged with the kind of electricity that makes the air itself feel dangerous. She opened her mouth to say something, maybe to explain, maybe to warn me. But before she could speak, the footsteps reached the foyer, and my world tilted sideways in a way that 37 years of motherhood hadn't prepared me for. Richard, walking through my daughter's mansion like he owned it, wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than my car. 25 years since I'd last seen his face, and it looked exactly the same, handsome in that dangerous way that had once made me forget I deserved better. The same smile that had charmed me into marriage, and then systematically destroyed every piece of confidence I'd ever possessed. The same man who'd walked out on us when Sarah was 12, leaving nothing but empty promises and a note on the kitchen counter. My breath caught somewhere between my throat and my chest, lodged there like a piece of food that won't go down. The flowers slipped from my fingers, chrysanthemums scattering across marble floors that reflected my shock back at me from every angle. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Sarah had sworn she'd never speak to him again, had promised me, with tears in her eyes, that she understood what kind of man he was. Grace. His voice was smooth as ever, like aged whiskey and broken promises. He said my name the way people say the names of acquaintances they run into at grocery stores. Polite, distant, completely devoid of the history that connected us, as if he hadn't once whispered that same name in the dark, made promises with it, used it to punctuate lies that I'd believed because I'd wanted to believe them. Sarah's face had gone white, the kind of pale that happens when blood abandons everything, except the essential organs. She looked between us like she was watching a car accident in slow motion, knowing the impact was inevitable, but powerless to prevent it. Her mouth opened and closed without sound. A fish pulled from water it had thought was safe. "I was just leaving," I managed to say, though my feet seemed rooted to the marble floor like trees that had grown there over decades. My purse, with the carefully wrapped mug inside, felt heavy enough to anchor me to this moment forever, heavy enough to keep me standing there, staring at the man who'd taught me that could be a weapon, and that trust was just another word for stupidity. But Richard smiled, that same charming smile that had once made me believe I was special, and gestured toward the living room as if he were the host, and I were the unexpected guest who'd arrived at an inconvenient time. "Don't be silly, Grace. You just got here. Sarah was just telling me how much she missed having you around." The lie was so smooth, so perfectly delivered that for a moment I almost believed it myself. I tried to make sense of it while Sarah stood frozen. A flicker of guilt crossed her face before she muttered, "Mom, things got complicated after Marcus lost his job. Dad offered to help with the mortgage, and it just happened." Her words landed like stones. Money had built the bridge I thought was burned forever. The memories crashed over me like waves during a storm, each one pulling me further away from the marble foyer and back to the small apartment where Sarah and I had rebuilt our lives from the wreckage Richard had left behind. She'd been 12 when he walked out, old enough to understand that Daddy wasn't coming back, young enough to believe it was somehow her fault. I'd spent months convincing her otherwise, holding her while she cried herself to sleep, promising her that some people just aren't built for staying. "He's not our family anymore," she'd said one night, her voice fierce with the kind of conviction that only children possess. "It's just us now, Mama. Just us against the world." She'd drawn pictures of our little family, 2 stick figures holding hands under a crayon sun, no third figure anywhere in the composition. She'd thrown away every photograph that included him, ceremoniously feeding them to the garbage disposal while I watched from the doorway, pride and heartbreak warring in my chest. The teenage years had been hard, but we'd navigated them together. When other kids talked about their fathers, Sarah would shrug and say she didn't need one. When Father's Day commercials made her cry, I'd hold her and remind her that families come in all shapes and sizes, that love wasn't measured by the number of people at the dinner table. She'd seemed to understand, seemed to have processed the abandonment in a way that left her stronger rather than broken. College had changed her, but I'd attributed that to growth, to the natural evolution that happens when children become adults and discover their own voices. The distance between us had felt normal, healthy even, the way daughters separate from mothers to become their own people. I'd never suspected that the separation might include reconciliation with the man who'd taught us both that promises were just pretty words that evaporated when tested by time and temptation. Standing there in her mansion, watching her avoid my eyes while her father moved through her home like he belonged there, I felt something crack inside my chest, not my heart, that had been broken and mended too many times to break again. Something deeper. The foundation of belief I'd built my entire identity as a mother upon, the certainty that love and sacrifice created bonds that couldn't be severed by money or status or the magnetic pull of DNA. How long had this been going on? How many times had she lied to me about cutting him out of her life? How many conversations had we had where she'd nodded sympathetically while I worried about whether he was safe, whether he was happy, whether he ever thought about the daughter he'd abandoned? And all the while she'd known exactly where he was, because he was here, living in luxury built on secrets and betrayal that ran deeper than I'd ever imagined possible. Has money ever driven a wedge in your family? Tell me below while you're still holding your breath. The silence stretched between us like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. Tension so thick you could have cut it with the sterling silver letter opener I glimpsed on Sarah's hall table. Part of me wanted to demand explanations, to ask the questions that were burning holes in my throat. How long? Why? How could you? But the larger part of me, the part that had learned dignity through decades of disappointment, chose a different path entirely. I bent down and gathered the scattered chrysanthemums with hands that belonged to someone else. Someone steadier than the woman whose world had just shifted on its axis. The flowers were bruised now, petals torn from their impact with unforgiving marble. But I collected them anyway. Small acts of restoration, even when the damage is irreversible, even when the gesture is more about maintaining grace under pressure than actually fixing what's been broken. "These are lovely," Richard said, and his voice carried that old familiar note of patronizing kindness that had once made me feel grateful for crumbs. "Sarah, didn't you tell me your mother had good taste in flowers?" The question was clearly a test, a way of measuring how much she'd shared about me, how much of our life together had become dinner conversation in this house where I was clearly not welcome. Sarah's answer was barely a whisper. "Yes, she always did." But she wouldn't look at me when she said it, wouldn't meet my eyes as I stood there holding flowers that had been meant as a bridge between us, and had instead become evidence of how wide the chasm had actually grown. Her voice carried the weight of guilt, but not enough guilt to change anything, not enough to choose differently. I reached into my purse and pulled out the wrapped mug, my grandmother's porcelain cup with its delicate blue roses, and set it gently on the hall table. "This is for you," I said, my voice steady despite everything crumbling inside my chest. "It was your great-grandmother's. I thought you might like to have it." The words came out clean and simple, unmarked by the complexity of emotions churning beneath them. My smile felt painted on, the kind of expression you wear to funerals when people ask how you're holding up. Professional grief, practice disappointment. The smile of someone who's learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is pretend not to be devastated by the people who devastate you. Sometimes dignity is the only gift you can give someone who's stopped deserving your honesty. The front door closed behind me with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence I'd never wanted to write. My feet carried me down the curved driveway, while my mind struggled to process what had just happened, what it meant, what I was supposed to do with the knowledge that my daughter had been living a lie that made me complicit in my own exclusion from her life. The security guard waved as I passed through the gate, the same polite gesture he'd made when I arrived full of hope and carrying flowers. But now I understood that his earlier expression hadn't been pity for my obvious displacement. It had been recognition. I wasn't the first unwelcome family member to show up unannounced. I wasn't the first mother to discover that success sometimes requires the careful editing of inconvenient truths. Each step toward the bus stop felt heavier than the last, as if gravity itself was conspiring to make this walk as difficult as possible. The afternoon sun beat down on my shoulders, and I realized I was still wearing my best sweater, the one I'd chosen because I'd wanted to look nice for my daughter, because I'd thought appearance mattered to people who were supposed to love you, regardless of what you wore or where you came from. A landscaper trimming hedges near the sidewalk looked up as I passed, and something in his expression suggested he'd witnessed scenes like this before. The carefully controlled exits of family members who'd overstayed, welcomes they'd never actually received. His nod was gentle, understanding in the way that comes from watching other people's private dramas play out against the backdrop of manicured lawns and architectural statements about success. I sat down at the bus stop bench, finally allowing myself to feel the full weight of what had just occurred. The wrapping paper from the mug was still in my purse, tissue paper that had once held my grandmother's cup, and now held nothing but the ghost of good intentions. I pulled it out and smoothed it flat against my knee, a nervous gesture that accomplished nothing except giving my hands something to do besides shake. The bus, when it finally arrived, was mostly empty. Just me and a few other people whose lives were small enough to fit into public transportation schedules. I took a seat near the back and watched Sarah's neighborhood disappear through the window, taking with it 37 years of assumptions about what it meant to be someone's mother. Some distances, I realized, can't be measured in miles or bus stops, or the time it takes to travel between one world and another. But I didn't know that the real shock was still waiting in my phone. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the same one where Sarah used to do her homework while I paid bills and planned meals around what we could afford, rather than what we wanted. The silence in my apartment felt different now, not peaceful, but hollow. The kind of quiet that happens when you realize conversations you thought were happening were actually monologues, performed for an audience that had already left the theater. My phone buzzed with a text message, and for one foolish moment, my heart jumped with the hope that Sarah had come to her senses, that she'd realized what had happened that afternoon was wrong, that she needed to explain or apologize or at least acknowledge that seeing her father in her home had been a shock that deserved some kind of conversation, that daughters don't just abandon mothers without at least pretending there are reasons. But the message was brief, brutal in its efficiency. "You shouldn't have come without calling first." 9 words that managed to contain every possible interpretation, except the one that would have required her to take responsibility for the situation she'd created. 9 words that placed the blame for an uncomfortable afternoon squarely on my shoulders, as if showing up to see my daughter was a transgression rather than an act of love. I stared at the screen until the words blurred, reading them over and over as if repetition might change their meaning or reveal some hidden kindness I'd missed on first glance. But no matter how many times I read them, they said the same thing, that I was the problem, that my presence in her life had become something that required scheduling and advance notice, that spontaneous mother love was no longer welcome in whatever new family configuration she'd constructed. The message disappeared after a few minutes, deleted remotely, leaving no trace of the conversation that had never really been a conversation at all. But I'd already memorized those 9 words, carved them into the part of my brain that stores the kind of pain you carry forever, the place where other people's words become permanent residents, reminding you daily of your place in their hierarchy of importance. I set the phone down and looked around my small apartment, the mismatched furniture, the photographs of Sarah at various ages covering every available surface, the carefully tended plants that had survived decades of my attention. Everything here was real, earned through sacrifice, and maintained through love. But somehow, it had become less valuable than marble floors and secrets, and the careful curation of family members who fit the desired aesthetic. This morning I made my coffee in a plain white mug, the kind you buy at discount stores when you need something functional, rather than beautiful. The mug with blue roses now lives in Sarah's mansion, sitting on some shelf or tucked in some cabinet, carrying its history into a space where history has been rewritten to exclude the women who sacrificed everything to make that space possible. I'm not angry, though I expected to be. Anger would require energy I no longer want to spend on situations I can't control. Instead, I feel something cleaner, clarity, the kind that comes when illusions finally dissolve completely, leaving behind truth that's stark but manageable. Some people grow up and grow away, and there's nothing maternal love can do to prevent that natural evolution. My morning routine has settled into something peaceful. I read a few pages of my Bible, water the plants on my windowsill, and write in the journal I started keeping after my mother died. Simple activities that require no explanation, no justification, no careful navigation around other people's secrets. Activities that belong entirely to me, performed for an audience of one in a space where authenticity isn't a luxury I can't afford. The phone rings sometimes, but it's never Sarah. It's my neighbor asking about borrowing sugar, or the pharmacy reminding me about prescription pickups, or occasionally my sister calling from Nebraska to complain about her arthritis. Normal conversations with people who don't require me to edit my existence to make their lives more comfortable. People who remember that relationships involve showing up, even when showing up is inconvenient. I've started volunteering at the community center on Tuesdays, helping other women my age learn to use computers. There's something satisfying about teaching skills that actually matter to people who genuinely want to learn them, about being useful to people who appreciate usefulness, rather than taking it for granted, about having knowledge that someone values, rather than wisdom that someone finds embarrassing. Yesterday I walked past a flower shop and stopped to admire the chrysanthemums in the window. They were beautiful, full, bright, unapologetic about taking up space in the world. I didn't buy any, but I stood there for a long time, remembering what it felt like to choose flowers for someone you love, before you learned that love doesn't always create space for the lover. Some lessons are worth learning, even when they arrive too late to change anything. Accept your expectations for tomorrow. Some stories don't have the endings we write for them in our heads. During all those years of hoping and sacrificing and believing that love creates bonds too strong for disappointment to break, some daughters grow up and choose fathers who abandoned them over mothers who stayed. Some truths are too complicated for greeting cards or simple explanations about family loyalty and the power of unconditional love. But here's what I've learned in the week since I knocked on that mansion door. Belonging isn't about blood, or shared history, or the sacrifices you've made for someone else's dreams. It's about finding people and places that welcome your whole self, not just the parts that photograph well or fit comfortably into other people's narratives about their success stories. I still love Sarah. I probably always will, but I love her now the way you love someone from a distance, with acceptance rather than expectation, with blessing rather than need. And maybe that's its own kind of freedom, for both of us. If this story touched something in your heart, if you've ever wondered where you belong in someone else's life, leave me a comment below. Tell me about your own moments of clarity, your own discoveries about where love lives and where it doesn't. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, honest, complicated, real, hit that subscribe button. I'll be here sharing what I've learned about the beautiful, difficult business of being human.